Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette, and this is episode 85, doing something I haven't done in a very long time. And at one point, I didn't think I'd say that because I used to do these all the time. This is going to be a recommendation show. In fact, it has been since episode 67 in November of last year since I've done a recommendation show. So this was long overdue. And I've got a great co-host I'll be bringing on in just a second, and we're going to tell you about 4 great shows in this episode, as well as our traditional discussion topic on a world of podcasting. But before we get into that, I do have a quick thank you and shout out I would like to make. As many of you know, have heard, I hope are well aware, I decided to bite the bullet and throw open all my vulnerability and ask for your support on Patreon. And a number of people have jumped on board in my most recent edition. Gentleman by the name of Matt Williamson. His link is now up on the supporters page on the website because he supported at $3 or more a month. So he is now linked up with that. Matt is soon to be a podcaster. He tells me shortly he will be launching a show that I will be telling you all about as well in the future. But in the meantime, he can be found on Twitter at, I believe it's Matt Will C, I believe. Let me just double check that to make sure I get Matt C. Will. I'm sorry, Matt C. Will. And he's also over at, let's see here. I've got to find his website, edgyconversations.com. So, Matt, thank you very much for joining the effort to support the Podcast Digest. I really appreciate it. And, folks, if you would like to do that, I would also be seriously indebted to you as well. Links are in the show notes to check out Patreon. If money isn't your thing, completely understood, okay? iTunes, reviews, just like money to an independent podcaster like myself. So if you would take a moment, leave a review there. If you're enjoying the show, of course, I'd greatly appreciate that too. So on with the recommendations episode. Excited about this. It feels like forever since I've done this. So I had to go back and figure out who do I know who is a podcast aficionado, who I know listens to a lot, and who I end up talking to a lot over the Twitter world, and basically I tend to give him crap all the time. You guys have probably seen it already in the show title. I'd like to welcome back to the Podcast Digest. It's been a very long time since I featured him in his show, but he is also a fellow Patreon, and I thank him for that. Ray Loflin from Couple Things Podcast, welcome back.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be back with you, and you do give me a lot of crap, don't you?
Yeah, I do, and that's why I thought it would be cool to ask you to join me on one of these so we can bring this crap back to the air.
I knew there was a reason I hadn't blocked you yet.
Well, there will be no meowing in this episode, that I can assure you. So the crap goes 2 ways there, right?
I was going to say, I do pay you back a little bit how I can in our show.
Well, I think you guys are a couple of weeks now without any meowing. I've sort of been disappointed.
So if I'm going to be full disclosure to you, I take all the show notes as we're going through our show so that I know what to edit. There is now a permanent Dan column so that I keep a tally on how many Dan Lizettes we mention on the show, so I know what to look for.
That was because you missed the one I told you about.
I did. That's the whole reason the column came up.
Well, folks, anybody who's listening right now who's not familiar with you, Ray, can you tell them a little bit about a couple things?
I am the 4th out of 4 hosts of Couple Things Podcast. We are a barroom conversation podcast. Essentially, it's 4 best friends, 2 couples. We're all married, literally to each other, it feels like sometimes. But we do conversational podcasts where we have different topics that we each bring to the table to drink while we're talking and have a conversation barroom style where we enjoy each other's company and let people hang out with us.
And it's an awesome show, guys. I was really, really fortunate in that I somehow, and I wish I could remember now, came across a couple things super early. In fact, folks, if you would like to get into the history, if you will, way back on episode 42 of the Podcast Digest, I had all 4 of these guys on the show. That was back in June of 2015. And then actually one of the 4 co-hosts that Ray had mentioned also joined me on a recommendation show about 10 episodes later in August, episode 52. Molly also joined me to do the same thing Ray and I are doing tonight, talk about great podcasts. So if you want more couple things after tonight, in addition to checking out and subscribing to their show, which I could not endorse more, they have also had their fingerprints all over the Podcast Digest as well.
We are award-winning, Dan.
Award-winning, that's right. They were also my Independent Podcast of the Year for 2015. That's right.
That was a surprise for us, for sure.
And folks, I'm not just saying this because Ray's on here. Like you mentioned, in my award show, I also gave them my Independent Podcast of the Year award. I truly love the show. These guys are awesome to listen to. They do so much fun stuff. You listen to an episode or two, and you will not want to miss anything else. They will make you laugh, and they will make you wish you were as cool as they were, as I've now started to say. So.
I don't know how much I believe the cool part, but I'll take you at your word for this time.
Well, it is good. It is a good thing.
Okay, cool as the other 3 is what you really meant to say, Dan.
Of course I'm excluding you from that kind of label, Ray. Come on.
Exactly.
I mean, Ray, your 98 AIM username on Twitter at Jagiler, I can't label you with cool with a Twitter handle like that, can I?
Seriously, man. It's the only reason I keep it now is because it is from like 98. It's like an antique. And in a digital age, how else are you going to keep an antique?
It's like posterity. It's like, right. I want to remember the late 90s. So I'm going to keep this username.
Yeah, essentially. I think it was like 6th or 7th grade. I made it in the library with my friends.
Good stuff. Good stuff. And I also pick on Ray because Ray is probably like me. We're probably the 2 tallest podcasters in the world. I'm convinced at this point. So we developed that kinship right off the bat. So
we see eye to eye, literally.
Yeah, literally. And, I wouldn't say that. What are you, like 6'3", something like that?
I am. I'm 6'3".
Yeah, nothing. I'm 6'7". I mean, come on.
Wow, you got me beat by a long shot. So
you're the only one in my proximity, that's for sure.
Okay, fair enough.
That'll work. Well, folks, let's get into this. Let's start talking about some great podcast stuff. I've got Ray here. I know Ray's an avid listener, which is why I wanted him to join me. But before we get into our specific show recommendations, although it's been a while, I do remember the format. We like to kind of start these out with sort of what I call my discussion topic, and oftentimes want to talk about something kind of going on in the world of podcasts. I've always made this show for podcast listeners, and if you're an avid podcast listener like me, you may have heard about this particular topic, and I know it'll probably affect you in one way or another because so many people listen to, subscribe to, and are a fan of, like myself, a lot of the NPR shows. So NPR's been in the news lately. Let me just kind of run down this topic, bring you guys up to speed, and let you know what I kind of want to pick Ray's brain over here. NPR has been in the news because they recently sent out a memo to their local affiliates. NPR's National Public Radio, there are local affiliates all across the country, and specifically asked them to make sure that when they reference one of their podcasts, that they don't do so in a promotional way. They specifically didn't want that to happen. Now, NPR fans, public radio fans, are probably a lot of you. A lot of my previous guests are in public radio or came from public radio. So I imagine a lot of you listening today may have come because of those interviews. And there are a lot of passionate, hardworking, wonderful, creative people in public radio, but they're kind of going through this identity crisis right now where most people would consider radio a dying medium, if you will, or at least one in somewhat of a slow decline. And podcasting is starting to take up a lot of people's listenership, a lot of their time. I know for me, I haven't turned on the radio in my truck in probably 2 years. Why? Because my phone connects via Bluetooth and I listen to podcasts. So my radio listenership is pretty much gone. And I know I'm not the only one. Many of you listening are probably the same. So people are asking, NPR, the future is not radio. Why are you telling your listenership who listens to radio not to go check out your podcast? So there's been this huge back and forth about, are they making the right move? Should they be doing this, et cetera, et cetera. But so this will dovetail in sort of a secondary conversation about kind of the coexistence of national public radio and independent podcasters. But before I get into that piece of it, Ray, what do you think? I know you've probably listened to some NPR shows, probably some of the bigger ones, just like me. What do you think about NPR's decision to say, don't actually promote or create a call to action on the local affiliates to their podcasts? I
think it's a conservative move, Dan. To me, I'm just like you. Probably for the past 2 to 3 years, it's always been audiobooks, talk radio that's streaming, and then simply podcasts is simply what I'm listening to. So they lost my radio ship as well when it comes to a listener. But podcasts at the same time are hitting mainstream media. I don't know how much they are a part of everybody's life. And I think because, we're in the podcast bubble, we get that exposure, and it's a nice, we are knee deep in this whole podcast thing. But I'm curious if they're playing the waiting game. It feels like they're playing that long game to see whether or not podcasts actually do this takeover, or whether or not they should have stayed with radio the whole time.
Yeah, and I'm looking at an article here on npr.org from their ombudsman, right? So kind of that independent party that sort of speaks to a lot of the issues for NPR. And one of the paragraphs from here kind of jumped out at me, and it says, as Benton and others interpreted it, the policy reflects the desire of member public radio stations, which control NPR's board of directors, to protect their connection to local listeners through radio listening by downplaying ways to bypass that channel of listening, i.e. through the app or digital podcasts. So it seems to be this kind of power struggle between local radio station managers and the larger national NPR arm, which is putting out a lot of these great podcasts. And they're saying, look, don't tell our listeners to go turn into you and me, Ray, right?
Yeah.
Where we don't turn on the radio anymore. And NPR is kind of abiding, at least for now.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, though, because you're trying to protect your local brand. A national brand, I think, could maybe get away with it because they have such a wide, broad range of listeners. But you're going to get hit closer to home if your local audience all of a sudden starts tuning out. So I see it. I see where they're coming from, I guess. But it's one of those things you kind of got to get with the program. Technology is always moving, and this is another one of those instances.
Yeah, and so the question is, do you think NPR is shooting themselves in the foot by kind of assuaging these local station managers for now?
It is an interesting conversation, and I think in some ways they are. And this is, again, going back to my conservative play, because these are really popular shows we're talking about. Like, everybody knows a lot about a lot of these shows that NPR puts on a daily to weekly basis. So I think they're banking on name recognition. If they did all switch to podcasting, it wouldn't be a huge hit to them. But at the same time, it's I use this analogy a lot. I know last week you were talking. What was his name? Scott Holden.
Scott Holden. Yes.
Yeah. That the conversation you had with him about podcasting, I thought was very interesting. And part of it that I wanted to even chime in while you were talking to Scott was about how when I explained to someone what podcasting is, because you, Scott, and I all get asked what is podcast. I have to explain that it's almost like TV in some way, where I don't have time to watch all 10 things that I want to watch maybe at 9 o'clock. I only have time to pick 2 or 3 that I'm going to maybe DVR or watch at 9 o'clock. And so podcasting is one of those things where once someone finds podcast that they like, they kind of stick with it. It's a lot like programming, to be honest with you. You expect a podcast from you, Dan, every Sunday. And I know that it's, by yourself, by the way. You got to get that out. So I know on my Monday morning commute, I have Dan Lizette in my car with me, though. And it's the same thing with us. We make sure our show is out every Tuesday in the morning, so that on Tuesday, when people are commuting, they have the chance to listen to us. But that Tuesday time slot then is taken up by people who enjoy our show. And so if NPR holds back too long, those slots are going to be filled up potentially, with people tuning into podcasts, but it may not be NPR podcasts.
Yeah, and I think one of the other important things to make mention here, because somebody educated about this topic is screaming at their phone right now, and I should mention this as well because the ombudsman for NPR does mention this. I just want to read this. Money, of course, in the form of member pledges and donations is ultimately at the heart of the issue about where to listen. It's not possible to pledge directly to NPR, just to local stations, which then remit a portion of those pledges to NPR in the form of dues that pay for the NPR programs. It is possible, however, for listeners to directly support some podcasts, including some distributed by NPR. So you can see where the local stations are saying, wait a minute, the only money source we have is for our local listenership, even though you have podcasts that can take donations directly. So why are we going to potentially promote those podcasts, taking our potential donors away from, take those contributory dollars they may have and not give them to the Columbus, Georgia station or the Richmond, Virginia station, and instead give it to the NPR national podcast?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. But then the other part of it is this, oh gosh, what am I trying to think of? It's the term where, your loyalty, essentially. Like, these stations have supported NPR for God knows how long. And now, potentially, NPR can kind of almost not turn their back, but almost start promoting a different way, bypassing these stations. And so these stations are saying, hey, I've propped you up for all these years. All of a sudden, you're going to cut me out.
Yeah. So. It's an interesting back and forth, and they kind of made news. I think this was about a week and a half ago. March 18th, the Ombudsman published this article. So it's out there, and I'll link this article up in the show notes as well, folks, if you want to take a look at what the NPR Ombudsman talks about with this. It's an interesting read if this type of stuff interests you. If you've been a public radio listener for any period of time, or you're into podcasts and have maybe jumped over to public radio because you like a lot of their shows, it's worth a read because it will be sort of impacting what you're going to be listening to, it sounds like, for the coming months and years. Speaking of listening, as I mentioned a minute ago, sort of a related topic here, and this is one that I think Ray and I will have a personal take on, if you will. Another thing that I've been hearing in the echo chamber of the podcasting world over the last few weeks in terms of NPR and podcasts, we mentioned how there are so many great ones out there. I listen to many of them, like Wait, Don't Tell Me and Fresh Air and so on and so forth. And of course, This American Life, is that are these big guys, and this isn't just NPR, but NPR is a great example. I mean, you could also look at CBS, you could look at ESPN, you could look at a lot of these other large corporate conglomerates now making their way into the podcasting space because podcasting is doing pretty darn well. It's still got a lot of growth to do, but it's certainly bigger and more with a bigger spotlight on it than, say, 2 years ago, pre-serial, as I like to say.
Yeah.
And a lot of the independent podcasters who are maybe here all along and have maybe been thirsting for a larger audience feel that the larger shows are simply consuming everyone's attention, and that whether you look at the charts or New and Noteworthy or, Stitcher or whatever the case may be, that the smaller guys, the independents, are kind of getting squeezed a bit by these larger, big corporate conglomerates coming in. And a lot of people are starting to object to it, including suggestions I've heard about, maybe there should be two charts, what they call, what the suggested name put forward was, quote unquote, procasters, people coming from, a big budget background, and podcasters, which would be more like you and me, Ray. And so that idea has been floated, and there's several others that I've heard in terms of that. But I kind of really wanted your take on it, Ray, as an independent podcaster like myself. What are your thoughts about these big guys? Because it seems like every day, every week, there's a new one. So what are your thoughts?
This is a tough one because, this is kind of the first I've actually ever heard / started talking about. So this is kind of almost my gut reaction to this type of problem that people obviously are talking about. It's one of those things where I see the need for indie podcasters to have their own space, to be able to grow, to be able to maintain a following, but I'm almost of the mind that the best rises to the top in a lot of ways. And I'm very slow to the idea of changing up how people find you. But at the same time, there are times when I really do want to listen to those, for lack of a better term, AAA podcasts that are, name brand, big budget, have a massive following. But then there are other times I want that indie, and there's no easy way to find the indie sometimes without sifting through the all podcast section under a sublet of society and culture on iTunes. So I don't know. I don't know enough, unfortunately, to come up with a true opinion for myself with how I feel about this. It would be nice, I think, to promote indie podcasters a little more, But at the same time, I think iTunes is realizing probably that they're going to get the biggest listeners from, like the biggest numbers from an ESPN being promoted on their front page, from, Wait, Don't Tell Me and Stuff You Should Know and all these name brand podcasts. That's who people are going to latch onto immediately, and then may branch out from there to the indie scene.
Right. And I pretty much agree with your take on that one, Ray. Let me just throw one more thing at you. This was something else that was raised in the counterpoint, or the person I heard who had a huge objection to this. And this was, they're an independent podcaster, and they looked their own show up in iTunes. Now, we're talking about desktop iTunes, right? If you've ever looked your own show up, or any show for that matter, in iTunes, you will see along the bottom, you may also like. Along that bottom strip of you may also like, the person was completely disheartened when them, as an independent podcaster who'd been putting out episodes week after week for years, saw this populate with quote-unquote dead shows, pod-fated shows that hadn't put out an episode in 4 or 5 years, and national large market podcasts, and a couple of indies. And her argument was, if I'm an independent podcaster releasing things weekly, wouldn't you want to recommend other independent podcasters who are releasing things weekly? Why are things like the algorithm surfacing quote-unquote dead shows, as well as shows that are clearly wildly different than mine?
That's a definite problem. Like, I have a problem with that personally, too. I'm one of those people who loves to watch how we do in the iTunes ratings for just all podcasts in our subcategory. And I was really excited when I started seeing actual shows being recommended other than the top tier shows, like ones that were closer to our genre. But, looking at those, some of them were dead. And it's a shame, because you have to assume you're showing up on the recommendation page for some of these other shows that are dead. And it's just this circular action that potentially is harmful to your numbers because your show's just not being promoted like the other ones. So I have a problem with that for sure.
Now, on pod-fated shows, and I'm going to jump into my opinion here in just a minute on this stuff, but I don't want to go on a long diatribe. But on some pod-fated shows, do you believe that if they haven't had an episode out in a couple of years, that they could or should still be appearing in charts or, in the algorithm's recommendation engines? And I'll give you this point. The one that was raised very regularly was the history of Rome, or the history of the world in 100 objects.
Yep.
Right? The history of the world in 100 objects has
actually
100 episodes.
Yeah.
And it ended like 4 years ago. Still a great show with a lot of awesome content, but it kind of ran its course, right? It achieved its original goal. People still listen to it, and it's evergreen content and valuable. But where do you come down on that, Ray, that even though it hasn't put out anything new, it's still sort of evergreen and valuable? What do you think?
I've always personally thought that it was like the Wild West with iTunes, because let's be honest, you can say anything and do anything you want on a podcast. There's nobody to police you. There's no ESRB rating that has to be on your show. It's up to you in a lot of instances to say whether you're explicit or not. So the fact that there's just no, for lack of a better term, governing body almost that's going to keep an eye out for these things, I think they have to exist because there's nothing in place to do something about it. Now, am I in favor of this? Probably not. I think it's a lot like television. I think that after you've been broadcast on network TV for a while, your show should maybe be moved to a different section or a different area where people can go back and find it if they want to. But it's not mixed in with all of the current shows that are ongoing, that, you're not filling up that go find a podcast area with content that people probably aren't going to want to listen to if it's not happening right now. Because it's just so hard to find a show that's good to begin with. You're making it that much harder by adding in, I don't know what the numbers are by any means, but like, let's just say 20% of these podcasts that you can potentially find while you're drilling down aren't something that's ongoing. And so you get frustrated. I mean, I get frustrated. I love finding podcasts. I'm constantly looking for podcasts that are going to be fun. I love to go to the What's New section because I know these are podcasts that are actually being made right now. And so that's an easy way to do it. But, I get frustrated when I start looking through and it says, this person hasn't put out a show since 2014. And I'm kind of like, well, I don't really want to invest my, limited time in the car every day on a commute listening to a show that's never going to be made further and I can't be more invested in at the end of it. Now, something like the Rome one sounds very interesting, and that's kind of what I was thinking of when you were talking about this. But, those, not all shows are like that. And it's just hard to say, how do you come to the right decision with a show, because not everybody knows what a show's about.
Right.
I guess. Yeah. So
I agree. And I agree with parts of that. I'm going to disagree with some of it. So let me give you my take on this. So here's one suggestion I'm thinking in terms of kind of making sure the current thing. I would think it would be great if there was a little dial selector on the charts that said last 30 days, last 6 months, all 2016, from 2012 on or something like that. And you could see, you could do it by release date. So of all the shows released since, January 1, what are the top downloads? Because that would pull out those quote unquote dead shows or evergreen only shows, right? And so if you don't want to see that, it's gone. But keep the traditional charts on sort of the all time or the existing algorithm to still surface those, because whether it be History of Rome, History of the World, 100 Objects, or, some of the, like a yoga podcast or, something that is more serialized. I think about, my previous guest, Aaron Mankey with Lore. All right. One of my favorite shows. 5 years from now, if he stopped making that show tomorrow, those episodes that he's put out have absolutely no reference to current day. Those are going to be great shows, I feel, that somebody could and should still check out 5 years from now, even if he stops making the show tomorrow. I don't think they're any less valuable that he's since moved on to a different project, right?
Yeah, that's a great point.
I think there's this inherent idea, and depending on the show type, I think there's value in it. But when you speak broadly, like you said, podcasting is the wild, wild west, right? iTunes is. That you could do so many different things. One of the shows I'm going to be actually, both the shows I'm going to be talking about here in just a little bit are also of that. You can listen to them when they launched or go back to stuff they did 2 years ago, and there's going to be no difference in what you get out of it because it's not present. It's not news-centric, right? Sure, if you're doing a topical this last week's news or this movie that came out this week or whatever the case may be, that's not going to be relevant, even a month from now. But if you're talking about something like lore or something like stuff you should know, or something like that, more than likely, those episodes are still great content 2, 3, 4 years from now. So I would argue that it should be included. So that would be where I would differ. Now, in terms of just these big guys in here in general, my feeling is bring them on, right? I want more and more and more big guys to come over, because I think the last stat I heard is that something like 30% of all adults between 18 and 49 have listened to at least one podcast in the last month. Well, one podcast in a month isn't very much. 2, that means 70% haven't. There is still a huge number of people, like you mentioned earlier, Ray, in my conversation with Scott last week, that don't even know what a podcast is. So if CNN wants to come over, Sports Illustrated wants to come over, ABC News wants to come over, all these other big players want to come over and join the party, fine, and bring that other 70% with you, because I guarantee you some of them are going to like what I do. And that's the way I look at that.
Yeah, no, I mean, they wouldn't do it if there wasn't money involved. But Absolutely. The money means that there's going to be an audience. And the audience is going to, I mean, I don't like the term, but trickle down to someone like us, like Couple Things Podcast. Or, well, not you, Dan. Dan, you're, you know what? Don't even put yourself in the same category as us anymore. You're too high up.
Oh, boy, that is a bad rumor. I'm going to go on an independent mission. I'm going to go make it my life's mission for anybody who thinks I'm big time. I am sitting in my basement and I do everything by myself. I am regularly muting the microphone between whenever you talk, Ray, so that you don't hear my wife, kids, and dogs on the floor above me. If that makes me big time, then you know what? I just like to dispel all those rumors, because you're not the first one to say that to me. Oh, you're big time. No, I give the impression that I am, but I'm not really, folks. folks.
I'm going to step back real quick to your point about the whole ability to search. I love that idea. I think that's such a great idea. I'm not a big guy on YouTube, but when I do want to go find a video on there,
Yes,
I love using that feature. What was shown or what was published in the past month of this search that I'm going to do? Because a lot of times I'm looking up like news articles or news stories. And I don't want my, I might type in a generalized term, but I don't want that generalized term to give me something from a year ago. I want something relevant and now, and I love that idea.
Yep, YouTube, Google, exactly the same way, right? If you want to get the story of something that came out in the last week, like for example, when I found this article that we were talking about a few minutes back about NPR and the Ombudsman article, I put in NPR podcast radio, and it gave me all their podcast stuff. But then I flipped to the last 30 days and clicked the news tab, and boom, there it was, top result. Right.
So if iTunes that's exactly it.
Yeah, if iTunes had something like that, show me all episodes released in the last 30 days and give me a chart for that. Right. Because if you want to cut those out, there's an easy way to do it. And I think Apple and iTunes could institute something like that pretty easily, I'd imagine.
I think it's not going to cure the wild west symptoms that are in iTunes, but I think it's a huge step in progression towards making iTunes even more accessible. Like, it's not the perfect app for listening to your podcast, but it's where all the podcasts are.
Right.
So,
exactly. Yeah. Well, we're not going to solve the problem in this episode, Ray, but, hopefully we gave some folks some things to think about. And, but now what I want to do is give folks things to listen to. This is a recommendation episode. That'll wrap up our discussion topic. Let's move on to some shows that we're loving right now and tell you folks all about it. Before we get into it, just want to let you know, as always, when I do these things, all the links will be in the show notes. Make sure you swipe over, tap, swipe down, whatever you do to check out the show notes, because there you will find the easiest way to find all these shows that Ray and I are about to give you all the details on. So we got 2 each tonight. Ray, you want to go first, or you want me to set the example?
You go ahead, Dan.
Sure, I can do that. Let's set the example. I've got 2 shows to talk about. They are 2, ironically enough, sort of on the bigger side. I wouldn't say they are massive. They are not NPR shows, but they are fairly well known. But if you've not checked either one of these out, I want to strongly encourage you to do so. So let's talk about the first one. And I need to go back to my friends at Radiotopia. I've talked about Radiotopia a million times. I've been fortunate to be joined by pretty much half their roster, including one of the founders, Roman Mars himself. But there's another show on Radiotopia that is a completely different animal than just about anything else on the network and just about anything else you can really hear. It's called The Memory Palace. Host and creator is Nate DeMeo. It is a really different show. It is short, consumable, very easy to get into and to blow through a back catalog. At the time of this recording, there are about 85 episodes in. This is a single narrator show. Nate narrates the whole thing. He is oftentimes writing a narrative dialogue that he provides for the episodes, and most of the content is based on historical facts. It is probably along the lines of lore, except it's not necessarily focusing on, the mysteries or the kind of lore-ish, freaky type of side that Aaron Mahnke goes into. Just sort of stories from history that really make you think, make you sort of stop, make you maybe even catch your breath on some of these. First of all, Nate DeMeo is just beautiful to listen to. There are a few voices in podcasting that, as somebody who gets told too much about my voice, it's nothing compared to somebody like Nate DeMeo. And he has a great way of narrating. He adds sound and music as sort of a bed to his narration. And it's brilliant. It really is. He just recently brought on a producer to kind of assist because, like me, he was a full-blown one-man show for a while there. It is a unique show. It is traditional old-time storytelling, if you will. It is the concept of something that you're sitting there late on a Saturday night on a camping trip, and you've got this guy who always has great stories, and he launches into this 15-minute tale that will just make you stop, think, and realize, wow, that was awesome. That is kind of what the Memory Palace is. It is worth checking out. It is something that I encourage all of you, if you don't know it, if you're not familiar with it, to give it a shot, because it's one of my favorites. It's not, I believe he's at every 2 weeks right now, so it's not going to, blow up your feed or anything like that. Like I said, around 15 minutes every other week. And it's a great change of pace from the talking heads, what I do. It's not an interview show. It's not a comedy show. It is just a great story for a brief time, and something I couldn't recommend any more than I am. Ray, are you familiar with the Memory Palace at all?
Familiar with the name. It was recommended to me probably a month or two ago, and it's on my subscribe list already. Like, as you're saying this, I'm sitting here trying to go through and find it, and then I realized, I've already subscribed.
Good.
It's one of those things where I just have not given it the shot yet. And it's, again, back to that whole time crunch thing of what am I going to listen to? That the way you describe it, and it makes me want to use it as my road trip podcast.
Yep.
Because I love road trip podcasts that are story based. Like, when I'm on my way to work, I'm a lot of times, not excited, but I'm jazzed to get to work. I'm ready to go. I love listening to a conversation more than anything there. When I'm in my car and I'm just driving home, to Virginia or wherever, it's one of those things where I want a good story. And it feels like the Memory Palace is going to be that type of podcast for me. I'm so excited to even try this now.
Yeah, it's excellent. And it is, like you said, it is definitely one of those ones where you kind of want to slot it in the right deal. Like a lot of the conversation podcasts I listen to, and I'll use a couple things as an example. I mean, I'm not trashing in any way, not at this point.
I would.
But I mean, a couple things is great when kind of like you're doing anything, right? It's kind of just that company in your ear while you're walking the dog, doing the dishes, playing video games, whatever. It's just kind of, a good accompaniment to just about anything.
I call it a companion podcast a lot of the time.
There you go, exactly. But things like lore or things like the Memory Palace it's late at night, the house is already asleep, I'm not ready to go to bed yet. Or like you said, I'm taking a long road trip. Or, it's kind of like where you can kind of focus in on the story. If you have those moments in time ever during your week or whatever, this is a great one to slot in that place for sure.
That sounds like a great one. Especially, I love high production podcasts.
Oh yeah, you're not going to beat Nate's work with the Memory Palace. That's for sure. It is. It's exquisite. He does a great job, and the narration is unbelievable.
Awesome, fantastic.
That's my first recommendation from Radiotopia. Nate DeMeo, the Memory Palace. Ray, let's hear your first recommendation.
Well, you already took both of mine. They were Lure and SYSK, stuff you should know. But I guess I'll have to dig a little deeper. So. Anybody who hasn't listened to Couple Things doesn't know me yet, which is probably a good thing for your listener. But they probably don't know that I am not a political guy at all. Like, I don't, my saying for myself is almost always, if it's not on SportsCenter, I don't know about the news. It's one of those things where I love sports, I love video games, but I don't keep up with current events very well, except for this podcast, and I love it. It's one of those shows that it's not every week. It's actually more or less bi-weekly to once a month, depending on the climate and that sort of thing. But it's called Skeptic Rat. And it's like Skeptic Rat is more how they try to say it. And the best way I can describe it is their opening line, which they always say, coming to you from the far center. It's a very political and news-oriented podcast hosted by Noah Illusions, which he always puts it all together, so it's No Illusions almost, and then Heath Enright. Both of these guys are fantastically hilarious. They have just the most witty takes on the news. One of my favorite tweets I've ever seen, and unfortunately they don't keep up with this podcast's Twitter as much as I wish they would, and I'll explain why here in a little bit, but one of my favorite tweets I've ever seen is, we've now gotten angry comments from Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, and Socialists. That's a victory, isn't it? And I can't summarize this podcast almost any better than that, because they leave no stone unturned when it comes to who they're ready to insult or bash around a little bit. They essentially take the political correctness out of politics and news and are willing to step over every line It's not safe for work, so we'll go there with this one. The really fun thing, though, is that they play off each other so well, and they have segments, but at the same time, it's very much this banter that they have, this great communication between each other. And if you're like me, who doesn't take politics as seriously as some other people, because you're going to listen to this podcast potentially, and then have some knowledge, but it's never going to be enough for you to engage with someone else. It just makes you have the ability to chuckle at what someone else is preaching to you about the politics more than anything. Right now is the political season obviously going on, and so they're doing fairly regular shows. One of my favorite things right now that they're doing is that they're covering all of the primaries, and they have these huge reaction shows to all of the debates. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Democratic side or the Republican side. They just go through line by line in these things and poke all the holes that are there to be poked. Essentially, they want to poke everything they can. And I was, preparing for this show with you, Dan. I was sitting there trying to think of the best way to kind of communicate who these guys are a lot of times. And to me, it's almost like listening to political commentary from your uncle, who really doesn't mind speaking what he thinks after he's had maybe a few drinks at a family function. And it's one of those things where, but unlike your uncle maybe has one viewpoint. These guys will take any viewpoint on. It doesn't matter where it is, and they'll just go into it as much as they can. So if you like me, you're not a political guy, but you like the satire maybe a little bit, I recommend that show, Skeptocrat.
And the links will be in the show notes. I got them here, Facebook and Twitter for sure.
Oh, I guess I should mention, so they do two podcasts. The Skeptocrat is one of them. The other one they do, which is a weekly show, and this should tell you something about them, is called The Scathing Atheist.
Yeah, I came across that here too.
Yeah, that's kind of their main one. They do a lot of their tweeting out of that. And that, because that's a weekly show, I think they get a lot more engagement from people. I've listened to that one too. It's pretty much the same thing about religion, though. So if you want to go
taking
down
it all apart,
yeah, essentially they don't mind going anywhere with anything. So if you're going to follow them on Twitter, you got to go find The Scathing Atheist, or Heath Enright is on there as well. I think No Illusions handles their Twitter for Scathing Atheist, but it's just one of those fun shows that when it pops up in my news feed, I always turn it on. It's one of those things, Dan, that if it's Monday morning and Skeptocrats is on there, I'm going to listen over you. I'm sorry. But,
wow. Okay.
Gotcha. Well, whenever it does come on, it's just a treat, is what I'm saying. So,
well, I'm going to have to up my satire game for Ray's Monday morning commute. But that is a new show to me. Like I said, I've got the links here for everyone to check out. Definitely, I guess I'm pretty much a political junkie. My wife would tell you that I'm a political junkie. So
really?
I wonder if being that immersed in it, I'm like you, my wife. Was it Sunday evening? I watched the first NCAA tournament game that was on TV in the living room, and then before the second one came on, I went back to watch it in the bedroom, and my wife stayed in the living room. And I said, "Hey, here's the remote. Do you want to watch something else?" She's like, "Of course I do. All it is politics and sports." It's literally the only two things I ever have on television this time of year. And when it's not the political season, I'm like you. It's all sports all the time.
Yeah. So I don't know that this is going to make me want to pay more attention to the politics, though I am starting to pay more attention because I feel like I have to be more informed. But it's one of those that it's a nice break from pretty much my other podcasts that I love listening to, because these guys are I don't have another podcast on my list that is like these guys, and it's one of those things that I just enjoy it no matter what.
Well, its uniqueness in and of itself says something for it, and it sounds like it's worth checking out just to figure out
how it fits.
Yeah, how it fits with everything. So
right.
All right, so that's one down each, folks. We've got Memory Palace and Skeptocrat, and so now I've got a second one for you, and Ray will be delivering one here in just a moment. My second one is from Earwolf, and I don't know exactly how I came across this show. In fact, Earwolf is a home for a lot of good stuff, right? Earwolf and Midroll Media are now together. Midroll Media is a huge podcast advertiser provider, if you will. They provide a lot of the ads, a lot of folks here on some of their favorite shows. And they also launched Howl recently. If you listen to Mark Maron, you know that Howl is kind of, they're trying to be the Netflix for podcasts. For like $4 a month, you get access to all Mark's back catalogs, along with a lot of original stuff, so on and so forth. So Earwolf is a big deal. Well, one of the shows in Earwolf that I am absolutely in love with, and I will tell you, I am working diligently to hopefully be able to talk to this gentleman in the future. His name is Matt Gorley. He's the host of a show called I Was There Too. Now, if you're not familiar with this show, let me tell you about it, and let me tell you why I think you will love it. First of all, do you like movies? If you like movies, you should be listening to I Was There Too. The concept behind this show is really unique. It is not a movie review show. It does not tell you how the movie was made. It does not question why the movie got made. Instead, what Matt did was he goes and finds bit players in a show who had a very small role in a movie. It could be one scene or maybe one line, or in some cases not even a speaking part, but pulls them in and interviews them about their experience in making the movie. How did you get the role? What was the audition process like? What was it like working with that director? Can you tell us any behind-the-scenes stories about so-and-so and so-and-so? And it is awesome. It is so interesting. Matt is a super interesting guy in terms of his interview style is 10 times better than mine. And he has had some awesome guests on it. The current episode, as we sit here, is with Gilbert Gottfried and his role in Aladdin. And that, in and of itself, the first 10 minutes of that episode, you will never stop laughing. I do not want to give away what Gilbert Gottfried does during that, but it is pretty amazing.
I just looked it up, and I saw Gilbert Gottfried, and I got really excited.
Oh my gosh, it is unbelievable. But I've been listening to this one for a while. It's only 32 episodes in, and it does it in seasons. But he talks with Sean Fry, who was one of the boys in E.T., right? You know, the boys who all ride the bike across the moon in E.T.? He was one of the boys. And so he talks to, now, of course, the adult about what it was like getting cast in that role, about the wardrobe that they make him wear, what was it like working with Steven Spielberg, and so on and so forth. They did 2 episodes with a gentleman by the name of Martin Casella, who did a bit part in Poltergeist and was also the personal assistant for Steven Spielberg on Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so these stories about how Raiders got made right at the end of Poltergeist and what it was like, you know, delivering this guy way before the internet. He delivered the script to Harrison Ford's house to see if Harrison liked Raiders of the Lost Ark. And he sat in his car for 2 hours as Harrison read the script, and just all these great, great stories from these people that you've never heard of in terms of their roles in the movie. I've been listening to this one for a while. They have episodes with Speed, one of the passengers on the bus in Speed. Paul F. Tompkins, who was in There Will Be Blood. I believe he was the father in There Will Be Blood. There's been episodes from Martin, if you like Pulp Fiction like I do, one of my favorite movies of all time. Marvin. The guy who sits in the back seat of the car that John Travolta actually shot him in the face. They talk with him. They talk with Marvin from Pulp Fiction. And so the interviews and the conversations about these people who had a front row seat to some of these amazing movies, the stories that come out of this conversation is really interesting, and the interview style is excellent. They're very laid back, very conversational, and I could not recommend I Was There Too more. And like I said, I'm really hoping to talk to Matt soon because I think just talking with him about his experience and talking with all these awesome people would be another super cool conversation. So, Ray, you said you weren't familiar with this one either?
Not at all, but I will be very soon because I'm looking, while you're talking, which is great because I'm sitting here filling time with looking through his list of episodes. He's got some great people on here. I'm looking at the Miss Doubtfire one.
Oh, yes, that was an excellent one too, yeah.
There's the Groundhog Day, which I loved watching as a kid so much. You know, there's Aliens on here, Star Wars Episode 1. I can't wait. I'm going to dive in from the beginning and go all the way through this. This might be another one that trumps you on Mondays, Dan. I'm sorry.
It should. This is one for sure I can personally vouch for, because I love this show, and he's it just seems like a really great guy. He's really likable interviewer. It's so funny. He's got this bit that's been ongoing for a while. He has an advertiser. It's Earwolf, so they're advertiser supported. But this advertiser apparently told him that they like and prefer when he curses in their ads. So every time he reads their ad spot now, it's just this diatribe of language, and apparently the sponsor loves it. So just hearing that episode after episode is hilarious, and he does it so well. But I mean, Matt Gurley, if you look him up, he's kind of a big deal in and of himself. He's not just sort of a podcast host, if you will. He's done a lot of things. He's performed at Second City. He's been Upright Citizens Brigade Theater. He's one of the creators of Super Ego podcast. He's been an editor for contributes both as a comic and an editor to the Maximum Fun family of podcasts. He's been around. He's done a lot of things in his career as well. He's very established. And like I said, he's one of those guys who I tend to try to follow around, because the work he does, regardless of the podcast, is always a blast. But one of his favorite projects that he does is I Was There Too. And I just love the whole concept and conceit behind the idea of interviewing this, what appears to be a small actor. But then when you hear, their audition process, what they went through to get the role, what it was like filming, and this whole behind the scenes story. You'll never watch a movie the same way. You see this actor on the screen for like 2 minutes, you don't think anything of it, but then you realize there's this huge backstory about how that person got on that screen. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking, these may be the behind the scene actors, but they're still actors.
Yeah.
They still had to audition. They still had a role to try to fulfill, and that's got to be so cool. I can't wait to listen to this.
It's good stuff, and it's my second recommendation of this recommendations episode. That is I Was There Too, hosted by Matt Gurley from Earwolf. Ray, your second recommendation.
So my final recommendation tonight, and it's funny that we were just talking about Star Wars, because this one is called Story and Star Wars. And I was hesitant initially to recommend this one, but I've talked about it on our podcast a little bit. It's even in, on our website, couplethingspodcast.com, we have a recommendations page of what the group is listening to kind of, and what we think our listeners might enjoy. And I've put this one on that blog before. But this one's called Story and Star Wars. I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. I was that kid growing up who had all the Star Wars cards in a 5-star binder with the pocket protectors to make them whole. I read almost every one of the canon books that I could growing up, and I've been a huge fan my whole life, other than the prequel trilogy. But that's a different story. So anyway, this is called Story and Star Wars. It's through Story Wonk, and that's STORYWONK. And this was a business that was started by a husband and wife team, Lonnie, Diane, Rich, and Alistair Stevens. And specifically, we're going to be talking about Alistair Stevens, because he's kind of considered a story expert, and he's a writer. And I know that I was reading up on Lonnie too, his wife, and she is a writer as well. She's won some awards. But what Alistair does in this podcast, and it's not much, they're each about an hour long, but what they're doing is that he is going in and looking at each episode of Star Wars and breaking them down into very small hunks of the story. He divides them up by their 3 acts and kind of analyzes them. He takes all of the characters that are shown in each one of these acts and talks through the motivations that these characters might have, or in greater clarity, what's going on in the grand scheme of thing. He analyzes them and uses the listener over the 9-part series to give his lectures on all 7 of the movies that are currently out right now. And so it was just, I'm not a writer. I'm very much a scientist. That's my job in my real job outside of podcasting. I am not someone who enjoys writing or the art of storytelling. I love listening to stories and I love having them told to me. But in this podcast, Alistair goes into such great depth with explaining the actual story to a listener, and especially to someone like me who loves these movies, has watched them a million times. And I think my favorite one that he does is the very first one, when he does episode 4, A New Hope, and he breaks that one down so ingeniously to the point where he analyzes why do people enjoy this movie? Why was it a success? Why are people enthralled with this movie and this series? And how did it bring people on board? And what were the motivations of Luke? And the way he did it and the way he ended up explaining it to you, and he came to conclusions and pointed out things that I had never realized. And I can't even count how many times I've watched these movies before. These are like my rainy day movie when it's raining outside and I can't do anything. I'm popping in Star Wars. But it's one of those things where he was doing such a good job explaining these things to me that I was almost sad when an hour was over and he was done with his lecture. And then I think I listened to it a second time because I didn't even grasp everything he had explained to me. And I don't want to spoil anything because I want people to go listen to this, but the way he explained every character's motivation made it so clear that when I watched the movies again after I listened to him, it made so much more sense to me. And so he recently did one a couple months back for The Force Awakens. And I'm maybe not a Star Wars purist. I enjoyed The Force Awakens. This is no spoiler or anything like that. But when I listened to him give his take on the story of The Force Awakens, it made me appreciate the movie that much more because the nuances that he pointed out in that movie were just beyond my comprehension at the time when I watched it. And so for anybody out there who is like me and is a Star Wars fan or wants to be considered like a Star Wars expert in a lot of ways, needs to go listen to this because you'll become even more of an expert. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know for a fact there are Star Wars fans that listen to this show. I know there are geeky, nerdy podcast lovers that listen to the Podcast Digest. I've talked with many of them. One of the things I'm big into is technology and technology podcasts, and there is a huge crossover between technology podcast fans and Star Wars. So,
no way.
Yeah. There will be many, many people who will be checking this out. And I've got the links in the show notes, and I found Alistair Stevens on Twitter as well. At Paper
He's a good
Bullets,
follow.
At Paper Bullets, which I think is a completely cool Twitter name.
Yes, he is. He's a good
lot
follow
better than
too.
Jugailer.
Listen, he didn't make it back in '98. I don't know what to tell you.
I have a feeling people are going to love this. From your description, this sounds like if you want to go deep, right? If you want to take your Star Wars knowledge to the next level, this is what you need.
I mean, he's not sitting there telling you every droid's name. Like, that was kind of the type of Star Wars fan I used to be. Like, I used to know every droid in the Yavin 4 scene when they're starting to load up and go attack the first Death Star. Spoilers, they attack a Death Star. So it's I used
40-year spoiler. I don't think
exactly. Yeah, if you haven't had your chance yet, I don't know what to tell you. So it's one of those things where I had the knowledge of kind of like the intimate knowledge, but I didn't have the lure and story knowledge from the movies. And I feel like this just filled this huge gap in my life that I didn't realize was there until I stumbled across him. And it's, like I said, it's 9 episodes, but 2 of those are like live tweet sessions where he's tweeting with people and answering questions on the air. So you get to kind of hear what normal people would ask a question of this guy. But if you want just the lectures themselves, they're only 7, and they're an hour a piece. And they're such an easy listen, and it's going to be one of those podcasts that's going to make you want to sit in your car for another 20 minutes so that you can finish his lecture before you go into work. I can't explain it better than that. And then I haven't delved into it, but they have a bunch of other podcasts that they do because they seem to do these, like we were talking about before. This is another one of those examples where this podcast should be on iTunes forever, because this is always going to have an application to those movies. You don't need to be up to date to be able to listen to this podcast and appreciate it. And it's one of those things where they have 7 different podcasts right now, everything from Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Veronica Mars. And then they have a bunch about like being a new writer on storywonks.com. And then you turn around, they got a bunch of archived ones where they go into the Harry Potter story with J.K. Rowling. Or they have one that's called Star Trek Slap Fight, where they essentially pick 2 random Star Trek episodes and pit them against each other and have the fans vote which one they liked more. So storywonk.com has a bunch of other podcasts that you can listen to. But if you want the jump in point, it's Story in Star Wars.
That sounds like one of the kind of nerdy, geeky fandom's required bookmarks to take a look at Story Wonk and those podcasts. And I say all those things with the utmost affection, folks. I pretty much put myself in that category as well. I love Star Wars. I don't love it to the level you do, Ray, but I was there on opening night. I've pre-ordered it. By the time you folks hear this, it's already out on digital. It's coming into my iTunes on the 1st of April, and I'm looking forward to it in terms of Force Awakens. So I may have to go check this out.
I was totally 20 minutes before we started shooting this, or even talking, I was looking at my Amazon pre-order of the Blu-ray of the movie that's supposed to come out like April 15th or something like that. I know that I'm just going to pop it in as soon as I get it.
Oh, that's if you don't order it on iTunes before then and have them both.
I know. I enjoy having a physical copy, but you're right. If I am a true Star Wars fan, I should go ahead and order that digital copy as well.
You might as well.
I might as well.
That way you have them in every place. You could have it mobile. You have the Blu-ray for when you're at home, and you have it mobile when you're out on your phone or iPad.
When I was in college, and this was like 10 years ago, and I'm doing that thing where I do it in my podcast where we just go off on crazy tangents, like when we get together with everybody. But anyway, I used to fall asleep to music, and I found that I used to love Scrubs, the TV show, and I would just simply play that with my iPod video, with my video turned off, and I would play the episodes through my speakers while I was driving home, and I was fine. It's going to be the same thing with this. I'm going to download it on iTunes, put it on my phone, and then when I drive to work, I'm going to listen to a half an hour of episode 9.
Yeah, just listen to the audio. That'll work. Well, folks, we gave you a lot of great things to play through your car speakers and to listen to. We've got 2 show recommendations each we told you about. Ray brought to the table Skeptocrat and Story in Star Wars. I told you about The Memory Palace, and I was there too. All the links and everything will be in the show notes. You can thank Ray and I later for blowing up your subscription list again and realizing that there's never enough time in the day to hear all this great stuff for sure. But before I put the cap on this recommendation show, Ray, please take a minute after accepting my thanks for joining me and tell everyone where they can find you and Couple Things Podcast on the web, on the socials, on the listening devices, so on and so forth.
So this is tough because I'm usually not the person that gives this spiel, but we are couplethinkspodcast.com. We are on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud. Whenever Google Play starts putting up podcasts, we're approved for that, so we're on there. If you want to follow us on Twitter and talk with us and join in on our conversations, because we always love it when fans listen to our random-ass topics and then come in and give us their take, please follow us and tweet to us at couplethinkspod, P-O-D. We are on Instagram as well, Couple Things Pod or Podcast. I can't ever remember. And then we're also on Clamor if anybody ever is on there. So Couple Things Podcast. Otherwise, me personally, if you want to follow me with my 120 followers,
it's an exclusive club. Get in on it, folks.
As Dan has said multiple times, it's my 1996 screen name, Juggiler, Jugggiler, and I'll be happy to talk with you there.
Awesome.
And before we go, Dan, thank you so much for letting me join you. This was a blast. I love hanging out with you every time we do this. We can't wait to have you on the show one day of our show.
And I can't wait to join you guys. And folks, I can't endorse anything more so, as much or more than any of the shows we've been talking about. Couple Things is exactly what Ray was describing. When that thing that arrives, you jump to the top of the playlist. That's what Couple Things is for me. No joke. I've gone back and looked at it at this point, and I believe This is probably my 5th feature or mention in 84 episodes. I had the whole gang. I had Molly for a recommendations episode. I recognized them in my awards show, and now Ray joined me for a recommendations episode. If that's not an endorsement, folks, I don't know what is. Check out Couple Things Pod. You won't regret it. I know I've sent many a folk there, and I hear all kinds of happiness and joyfulness and satisfaction and new friends that those guys have made from their ever-growing listenership. It's not by mistake, folks. Check them out. You will enjoy it. Folks, that'll do it for episode 85 of the Podcast Digest. I am back next week with another great interview of a show that you will also need to subscribe to. So get to these recommendations now. Check out the links in the show notes. Until next week, folks, my name's Dan Lizette for the Podcast Digest.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at Pod Digest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.